much, Chris, for inviting me along to do this. I do appreciate it. And for those of you who aren't familiar with my work, I'm going to be talking to you about the archaeological evidence for the magical protection of houses and other buildings. And if you're interested in finding out more about me or my research, or if you want to buy my book, which you can see on the screen right now, you can do that if you go to my website, which the details are on the screen. As Chris mentioned in the introduction, the thing that kind of got me into this subject was coming across a secondhand copy of Ralph Merrifield's book, The Archaeology of Ritual and Magic, while I was doing my degree in history. It looks at the archaeology of ritual and magic from prehistory to almost the present day. So it's a great big broad sweep that it covers. But there are two chapters in the book that look at the early modern period, which was the area that I knew quite a lot about from a history point of view. And I was very interested in the topic that he presented there and the objects that he was talking about in that book. And I realized that there was actually a huge amount of further research that could be done on that topic. So that was really the start of my research. And this is that book. If you haven't seen it before, it's well worth getting, obviously, in addition to mine. But yeah, if you want to look at the whole sweep from sort of prehistory to the present day, try and get hold of a copy of this book. Secondhand hardback is quite expensive, but I think someone has done a paperback more recently. Now, when we're looking at these objects, it's important to try and sort of consider the context in which they were used a little bit and the nature of the past as it was.
It is very close that it holds on the tongue as well, which blends quite well. I think you've done it.
On mute. There we go. Right, so if we look at sort of pre-industrial era UK, pre-industrial era England, people were sort of necessity closer to nature and mortality. I think as well in pre-industrial England, there was a visceral sense of magic as a powerful environmental force. And I'm hoping that as I talk about some of these objects, that'll become clear to you. And when we talk about churches, particularly pre-Reformation churches, they used to feel like magical places to be. I mean, they were some of the most colourful places you could go to. They had some good art in them of doom and saints and various supernatural themes. And also, you know, the religion that was practiced in pre-Reformation churches was spoken in Latin. So this was, most people couldn't understand it. And there were candles, there was incense, it was all hidden behind a strange rood screen. So it felt like kind of a magical ritual was going on, really, more than what we would now consider to be a typical sort of church service. And of course, there were no motors or electricity. The world around people at the time was brought to life by folklore and the supernatural. Certain places in the landscape were more important and could have more supernatural connections than others. So springs, standing stones, ancient trees, geological features were all places that were sort of liminal and where you could contact sort of more supernatural forces. And of course, in the past, I'd say anything sort of pre-1930s maybe, you could in rural areas find a cunning person, which, you know, if we think about cunning people, what we're really talking about is kind of a white witch, but really by another name, although actually they were mostly kind of grey and a little bit ambiguous, morally speaking, some of them were. The cunning people who were the sort of, like I say, the village kind of white witches, if you like, were people who could do for you things like divination, thief detection, they could do healing, they could create charms for you to protect you. And one of the things they also used to do was detection of Maleficium. So basically they could detect harmful witchcraft when harmful witchcraft had been practiced. So if people had, for example, suffered some misfortune or some ill health, they could go to a cunning person and they could identify what the source of that bad magic might be if there wasn't a more prosaic explanation. Now, the cunning people were really, really important. So, like so much so that even in 1593, George Gifford, who was a parish priest, he complained that his parishioners treated the local cunning folk as if they were his god. So that's pretty serious. You're going to see some different slides in a minute. Don't worry if you're seeing the same one still at the moment. Now I should talk briefly about the period of the witch trials, because obviously people associate a lot of these objects with the witch trials and with fear of witchcraft. Now, for those of you that don't know, England was kind of a special case in Europe regarding witchcraft. The situation in our country wasn't quite as bad as it was elsewhere. I mean, don't get me wrong, it was bad. You know, it really was bad, but not anywhere near as bad as it was on the continent or in Scotland, for example. So in England, we had a legal test if someone was accused of witchcraft. wasn't a very stringent legal test, but it was a legal test nonetheless, which you didn't have elsewhere. So if you wanted to accuse someone of witchcraft, then in the court, you had to prove that that person had caused harm by witchcraft. Now, at that time, it was enough that you would have enough witnesses to sort of verify what it was you had said. That was seen as evidence. Fairly flimsy evidence, but it was seen as evidence if there were enough witnesses, because of course the prevailing view was that witchcraft was true and real and that people actually could cause harm through witchcraft. But if you failed to prove it, you could be prosecuted yourself. So actually this deterred quite a lot of people from accusing others of witchcraft. And the other thing in England, which was different, was that if you were successfully tried for witchcraft, then you would be hung. You would be executed by hanging as opposed to burning, which is what happened on the continent and in Scotland. Now, again, it's not a big improvement, is it, on being burned alive? But being hung is slightly better, I suppose. But in this country, you could be burned for witchcraft if you were also accused of treason. If you were also tried successfully for treason. But if you just tried and successfully tried for witchcraft, you would be hung by the neck. And the cunning folk that I was talking about earlier, they were often involved in identification of witches. So, like, if people were saying that there was bad witchcraft going on, the cunning folk were often involved in saying who that person was who was responsible for that. Now, as I'm sure you all know, many of the people who were accused of witchcraft actually were guilty of nothing at all, except for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. They might be a poor person who was considered to be a drain on the parish, who basically annoyed some people. It might be someone who just shot a sharp look of annoyance at someone, and that person then felt they'd been ill-wished because it coincided with some bad luck in their life. There are all kinds of reasons why someone might end up being accused of being a witch, but usually it was wrong. Having said all that, the archaeological evidence does tell us that people genuinely did do black witchcraft or harmful witchcraft, and I'm going to show you a few examples just before we start looking at the counter witchcraft measures that people did. So here we have from Prestwich in Greater Manchester, some figures that were discovered in the basement of a pub, essentially. So in the pub next to the church in Prestwich, in the cellar, they found there was a false wall. They discovered that the cellar must be bigger than it looked, and they identified a false wall. When they took the false wall down, they found a small bag that contained these figures. And they also found a dried cat, and they also found what is described as some vegetable matter. Now, the interpretation of that could be that a cat was sacrificed, some roots or ingredients were pulled together for some kind of magical spell or ritual, and these figures were carved to sort of indicate who was the intended target for this witchcraft. And so that is a fact. All this stuff was then sealed away. So instead of just disposing of it or hiding it, they decided to build a wall to seal it away because they wanted it to remain in place, active, doing its evil work. Now, these figures have been stylistically dated to the 17th century. Another example here, this is from Gloucestershire in Dimmock, which is on the edge of the Forest of Dean. This lead tablet, which is very similar in nature to some of the Roman curse tablets that we're aware of, but this is much more recent, I suppose. It's a 17th century curse on a girl called Sarah Ellis. And this is written in mirror writing on lead. And it also has some sigils from the Key of Solomon, which was a popularly available grimoire at the time. And then another example here, this is a 19th century example from Hereford, from the city of Hereford. This was found behind some panelling in a room in the city centre. And it's basically a peg doll made with scraps of wood and some rags. Now, this was hidden away, and the reason we know it's a curse is because under the skirt, you can probably just about make out a kind of slight change in tone about halfway down the dress. And that's because there is a scroll essentially tucked up inside that skirt, which is a curse on another local girl. And so the reason I'm showing you these is because they're all just really good examples of the fact that people actually did do black magic against other people. And I'm sure that people were aware that this took place, and this was all sort of contributing to people's fear of witchcraft. Yeah, the fear that people could cause them harm by witchcraft. But witchcraft wasn't the only thing people were scared of. They were also scared of fairies. Now, when I'm talking about fairies, I'm not talking about Tinkerbell or the little fairies depicted in the Cottingley fairies photographs. Pre-Victorian fairies were a race of creatures that were very similar to humans, living in essentially a parallel universe where there were nodes in the landscape where you could interact with them, such as usually prehistoric round barrows and places like that, where there was like a portal between the two worlds. And there were also some rites and rituals that you could conduct, which would allow you to see the fairy if you were skilled enough. But woe betide you if you built on one of their fairy paths, or if you destroyed one of their fairy houses, like the old prehistoric places, because they might come out and shoot you with their elf shot. And obviously in prehistoric sites, you can often find prehistoric arrowheads. And these were seen as being evidence of the fairy being there, and this was elf shot. So you had to be careful with your fairies as well. People also feared demons. Demons was something they would learn about in their church through art, depictions of hell and gargoyles, etc., on the architectural details of a church. And of course, demons were also included in high magic rituals, the sort of thing that John Dee and certain heretical bishops were dabbling in. But of course, the predominant fear, the popular fear, was of witchcraft. And this relates to the innate sort of supernatural qualities of humans and the ways they might direct that energy at others for good or ill. Right, so when I first started doing this research, I wrote to 650 different archaeological units and museums asking if they had any counter-witchcraft objects in their collection. And their responses formed the beginning of my database on the subject. And also, it's worth just bearing in mind when I start talking about these objects that, that they only come to light during demolitions or repairs or by accident, because they're all deliberately concealed. And so we certainly haven't found anywhere near all of them yet. And for every one that gets reported to me, there's probably 100 that don't get reported at all to anybody. I've got over 1,000 examples of these objects in my files, in my own personal files. There is, believe it or not, a concealed shoes index in Northampton, and that's another type of finds that we're talking about. And they have examples of over 2,000 examples in their files. The most commonly found types of objects are witch bottles, concealed shoes, dried cats, written charms. We have protection marks which are scratched onto surfaces, and we also have things like horse skulls and other animal bones. So I'm going to start by talking about witch bottles. So the example you can see on the screen in front of you, I hope, is a 17th century witch bottle, which they're nicknamed Bellarmines, after a much hated Cardinal Bellarmine, who's a European cardinal. But actually, they're strictly speaking, their proper name is Bartman stoneware, and they come from the Rhineland in mostly Germany, but also a little bit of the Netherlands. Now, at that time in England, we couldn't really make good quality stoneware like this, so they were imported in their thousands. There were whole ships full of them that would come across to England from Germany, full of these, and they were usually filled with wine or beer. And then they were sold, and then the bottles, the vessels were reused time and time again because they're so strong and so robust. And yeah, but the important things to recognize about these bottles is that they are anthropomorphic in appearance. You've got a face on them. The salt glaze gives it a kind of leathery, skin-like quality, and there's a big round belly. And usually there's a motif or a sort of coat of arms emblazoned on the belly. In this case, it's sort of resembles a sort of daisy wheel figure. But yeah, this particular stoneware bottle was found about a foot below the hearth of this 17th century cottage, and it was buried upside down right in front of the hearth. Right, now, when we talk about witch bottles, it can get a bit confusing in some of the work that's been done about them, because there are some texts from the late 17th century which talk about the boiling up of a witch bottle in order to remove witchcraft from someone who's been bewitched. Now, I'm going to say right now that I think that there are two very clear different practices with witch bottles. There is the one talked about in the text, which is where these bottles are boiled to try and remove witchcraft from someone. And then there are the ones that are found buried in front of hearths, which I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the differences between them. So, for example, one of the texts is Joseph Blagrave's Astrological Practice of Physic, which was published in 1671. And he describes collecting some of the victim's urine in a bottle. So if someone thinks they're bewitched, he'll ask them to urinate into the bottle, one of these, and he would add some pins to the bottle, and then he would heat it on a fire. And he would says in the book that this would cause dreadful pain to the witch, who would seek out your house, come knocking on the door, and ask you to stop boiling the bottle. and in return you could barter for a release from the witchcraft. And there are other books. So Granville's Sadismus Triumphatus of the 1660s says a very similar thing, that you boil this bottle with the pins in it and you urine in it on a fire, and the witch will come knocking on your door, desperate for you to stop the boiling. And if it fails, if that doesn't work, you should bury the bottle, because that would be sure to do the trick. Right, now the thing about the texts is that none of them actually describe fully the contents that we find in these buried bottles. And it's this that leads me to suspect that there are two practices. There's the boiling of the bottles and there's the burying of the bottles. I think the burying of the bottles is the earlier practice, and it's been going on for quite a while already. And then this sort of pseudo-scientific boiling practice came along later, and the more educated people started writing about it in pamphlets. So inside these bottles, the typical contents that we tend to find, and this image you can see here is from Ralph Merrifield's book on the archaeology of ritual and magic, which I talked about earlier, from 1987. And you can see this example from Ipswich, which I know Chris knows is a town Chris knows very well. This has a mixture of pins and nails, which you can see most of them are bent in some way. There's a broken fork. There's actually a knot of hair there as well, a lock of hair. And this particular one also has a piece of fabric as well. Now, and here's another example that was found a bit later on. This was one that was found around 2000, 2001 in Greenwich. And you can see the big load of hair there. And there's also some pins, well, nails, which have been very carefully bent. And actually, the friend of mine who analysed this, he discovered that actually the radii of the bend is the same with these nails, even though they've been bent to different degrees. And he thinks they were all bent around the same other iron bar deliberately for inclusion in this bottle. Right, now, the typical contents, as I've said, we have iron in the shape of pins and nails. We have hair. The pins and nails are always deliberately bent. And we often also have things like nail pairings. We also have sometimes sharp pieces of wood, little sharp irritants, things like that. But it's hair, iron, and urine are the main contents. Right, now the interesting thing about the buried ones is that half of them are found buried at the hearth or inside the hearth in some way or another. A further 25% are found at thresholds, and the remaining 25% are usually found in other parts of the building, usually liminal edges of the building. But obviously the ones that we were talking about where the boiling thing took place earlier on, there's no specific location for that to take place at all. So that's another fundamental difference between the buried ones and the boiled ones, in that the buried ones are location specific and they seem to have a pattern of locations that you find them in, whereas the boiled ones could happen anywhere. Now, the emphasis on the hearth is really important because obviously within a house, the hearth is always open to the sky, so it is the most vulnerable point in the building. So I'm going to ask you to exercise your imagination for a second. If you imagine there's a witch or wizard somewhere nearby who hates you and is doing some magic, working up a spell, conjuring up some bad energy to send to you because they want to harm you by witchcraft. They release this energy, it goes off into the landscape searching for you in your house. It gets to your house, it's looking for a way in, and it can't get in because you're protected at the threshold, you've got the door shut, you've got the windows shut. It finds that the chimney is still there, it's open to the skies, it plunges down the chimney, it senses this anthropomorphic presence at the bottom, which is this witch bottle, and it's got inside it your hair, your urine, your nail pairing, so it knows it's you. It dives in to attack you, and it gets impaled on these ghostly spirit pins and nails, which you've deliberately killed before including them in the bottle. And that seems to be the basic kind of magical thinking behind these buried witch bottles. Just another image here. This is the Greenwich bottle, the one that those nails and hair came from. This is an X-ray of it. It was actually found inverted in the ground again, and you can see that the nails, most of the nails, had formed like a sort of solid lump around the neck. Right, so witch bottles in England, they're mostly concentrated in the southeast, Norfolk, Suffolk, Greater London. But as time moves on, they spread west and north. Now, the only country we find them in, we find them in the British Isles as a whole and Ireland a little bit. But apart from that, we only ever find them in the USA, where clearly some British people took that practice to the USA. But we don't find these, generally speaking, on the continent at all. There are some types of magic that occur in bottles everywhere, of course, but this particular type of bottle, this particular type of spell, we only find it in those areas. And here's a little subtle variation on the same idea. This is a lovely little bottle that was found in Dorset, in between Langton Matravers and Worth Matravers. It was found in a parish boundary wall. And you can see how small it is. The scale there is in inches. Apologies for the old school scale. This bottle is really small. It sits in the palm of your hand, and at first it feels like it's solid. But then after a few moments, the substance inside turns to liquid, which feels quite amazing when you first hold it. Analysis of the bottle showed that it was a mixture of beef fat or beef tallow and spring water. And so this is essentially like a cattle bottle rather than a sort of human witch bottle. And the idea is some farmer has put some of his cattle's fat inside this bottle, and he's trying to protect his cattle from witchcraft attack, essentially. And the idea is that the energy, the bad spell or the witch or whatever would come plunging into the bottle, seeking the fat of the animal, and basically be neutralized by the holy water that had been taken from a nearby spring within. And here's another little example that I was involved in. This was the basement of a building, a very large sort of manor in Essex, which overlooks the M1. And these two bottles were found in the hearth surround. And unfortunately, the builders, as they were chipping away, they chipped the bottom of the bottles off, and the fluid came out and the contents disappeared. But anyway, we found out that these are mid-18th century bottles, and at that time, the lady of the house was suffering a long lingering illness. And it seems like her husband or her family or her team, or maybe even herself, were trying to unbewitch her, essentially, by using these bottles in this way. And about 2 weeks after I was on site, they found another one on the opposite side of the hearth. Now, it's really interesting when people who own houses find this type of thing inside their house, they can become very superstitious. There's one example from Suffolk that I was involved in from a little village called St Nicholas, which is right on the border between Norfolk and Suffolk. And a bottle very similar to the ones I've already shown you, the one at the beginning, the one from Falmersham in Bedfordshire. Very similar to that one, was found underneath the hearth. And he contacted me, and he became very quickly quite terrified at the concept that this bottle, now that it had been disturbed, it might be that this bad energy that might have been neutralized by the witch bottle might suddenly be released in some way and cause him harm. And so he became very agitated, and it was very difficult to convince him to let us take it away and do analysis on it, but he did in the end let us do that. And this was actually filmed for an episode of BBC Two's History Detectives some time ago, and I was in it. And basically he was really insistent that I should be the one that reconcealed it when it got returned from the analysis, that I should be the one that placed it back in the hole, ready for it to be reconcealed, which I did do, but I didn't know that he'd sort of secretly arranged, because he's so superstitious and so scared, he'd secretly arranged for a little gang of nuns to be present who would pray as I lowered the bottle into the hole, which I had no idea that was going to happen. But if you have the misfortune to see that episode, you'll see that happen. It was slightly terrifying for me, but it was but it does demonstrate just how superstitious he was feeling about this. Right, so to a slightly less exciting sounding topic, but nonetheless still very significant, we're going to look at concealed shoes. Now, the example you can see on the screen there is one from Sittingbourne in Kent. This particular example, I think there are probably around 100 shoes actually were recovered from this particular building, which was the Plough, an old pub in Sittingbourne, which was demolished. And there were so many objects were found within it that actually they purchased a new set of museum cabinets for their heritage centre in Sittingbourne to house it all. So I might talk a bit about that later on, depending on how the time goes. But concealed shoes are earlier than witch bottles. Witch bottles date from the mid 17th century, or the sort of third quarter of the 17th century. Whereas concealed shoes, our earliest examples come from the early 14th century, which is much, much earlier, as I'm sure you can tell. And you can find them singly or in pairs. Occasionally, about 10% are in pairs. Actually, it's quite rare to find pairs, but certainly you can find them singly or in large groups, as was the case in Sittingbourne. And they can be hidden in between lath and plaster panels in walls. They can sometimes be found on little ledges inside chimneys. They can be found under floors, sometimes sitting on beams in roof spaces as well. All sorts of them all over the place. And so generally speaking, about 40% of them belong to children, and the remainder are broadly split between men and women. They're almost always extremely well worn. Okay, so they've got to the point where they really couldn't be used anymore. Part of the reason why shoes would be so well worn is that in the past they were quite expensive. They were artisan made things, and so you would basically make them last for as long as you possibly could, and they'd be repaired many times before you'd eventually get rid of them. Now, obviously, at that point, they've become kind of a unique record of the wearer's foot, sort of bunions and, our unique sort of foot shape, essentially. So in that respect, they can serve the purpose of like a decoy in a similar way to the way witch bottles worked. So, you know, again, you think again about this example of some harmful magical energy coming towards your home. It knows who to attack. It's going to try and attack you. It detects this foot, this presence of you, if you like, in the wall or in the chimney, and it will attack it instead of you. Or this is the idea, it seems to be. It's like a decoy for the energy. But there is also another association with shoes, which is important to consider. So there was an unofficial English saint from the early 14th century called John Shorne, and that's Shorne, S-C-H-O-R-N-E, with an E on the end, yeah. And he was a real person, a real priest who lived in North Marston in Buckinghamshire in the early 14th century. And he was reputed to have cast the devil into a boot, right? So now it might not seem that important at this point, but pilgrimages to John Shorne's shrine, even though he wasn't ever officially canonized, pilgrimages to his shrine actually were second only to Thomas à Becket in Canterbury at one point, incredibly popular. So there was an awful lot of money at stake with people coming to this shrine. So much money, in fact, that the royal family moved his shrine to Windsor for a time so that they could benefit from all the pilgrimage money that was coming in. Now, the important thing about that is that people would buy pilgrim badges, and the pilgrim badges all depict a little devil coming out of a boot. So this is a replica of John Shorne's pilgrim badge. But so many people went to the shrine, this idea of devils being trapped in boots or in footwear of different kinds became quite firmly embedded in people's minds. And in fact, he was so popular that not only were the pilgrim badges everywhere, but there were paintings of him in many, many churches on rood screens and the like. Now, whether the legend of John Shorne was a way of kind of like incorporating an existing practice into a saint's legend, which often happened, or whether his legend kicked off this kind of practice, we're not really sure, because at the point where this legend begins, we're sort of just at the point there where we don't actually find so many concealed shoes because there's hardly any buildings surviving from before that time that haven't been tampered with. So it's difficult to sort of prove one way or the other. But certainly the legend of John Shorne massively popularized the idea of connecting shoes with being able to protect against evil. Now, in some churches, we often find these shoe outlines carved into the stone. This is just a few examples from Canterbury. In the cloisters at Canterbury and all around that building, there are literally hundreds of these shoe outlines. And obviously, they also record the unique shape of the wearer's foot. And I think what's happening there could be related to a bit of pilgrimage, in that when you get there, you're making your mark, but also by sort of putting your own unique shoe outline on the church. I think people hoped that sympathetically you were drawing some of the kind of sanctity of the church or some of the sacredness of the church back into your own life through the sort of sympathetic resonance of your own shoe outline and your actual foot. Right, now I'm going to give you a little trigger warning here because we're going to talk about dried cats next. The first thing I'd like to say is that I really like cats, okay? So I'm not like anti-cat in any way. And but also just to warn you that we're going to see some images of dried cats, or certainly one anyway, which is not very nice to look at. And that's the next slide I'm going to show. So if you're at all squeamish about dried cats, please avert your gaze now. So this particular cat is from Eckington in Worcestershire, which is a village I used to live in. It was found inside a 15th century cottage, and it was actually found in the thatch. And it was actually pressed flat. You can see that this cat's been pressed flat between two layers of thatch, and it had just dried out in a very stable temperature in there. When the thatcher who was putting on a new layer of thatch, when he discovered it, he guaranteed, swore blind to everybody, that there's no way the cat could have got there on its own. It was definitely placed there. We removed the cat. Well, I didn't remove the cat, but the cat was removed from the thatch, and I was invited to come and inspect it. I came and photographed it, and I encouraged the owners to put the cat back in the thatch as the thatch was being redone, which she did do. So that's nice to know that it's been returned to its original resting place, minus a few flakes of skin and crumbly bits, which I'm sure you can see just around the cat there, which is really unfortunate. But yeah, cats, they dry out in stable environments like this. If they're at all damp or in a sort of humid area, they just decompose and rot away quite horribly. But when they're in certain places, they do dry out in a very stable way, such as this. There is a pub called the Red Cat in Norfolk, or a hotel there, and this cat exists in the display in the bar there. And lots of people used to think it maybe wasn't real because it looked like plastic or leathery. And the local dentist went and had it x-rayed just to prove, and there it is. It's a genuine cat, that one. But yes, so examples range widely with cats. They're really, really, really commonplace. There was a cat found wired to a floor joist in Dalton. A kitten found in a wall with its legs apart as well. Sometimes you get just the skull of a cat was found in the brickwork of a chimney in Cambridgeshire. Even in churches we get them as well. So a dried cat was discovered in the roof of St Cuthbert's Church in Clifton, and it was sandwiched between plaster and tiles. Another cat was found bricked up in a disused bread oven in Parrickham in Devon. We also have examples from famous cathedrals, like in Dublin. One was found as well behind the organ there. Now, as with horse skulls, which we're going to talk about in a bit, there's been various theories about cats. Some people think it's like a foundation sacrifice idea, and that you give a life to the building so it won't then take one later on by falling down on you. In fact, I once was lucky enough to have a chat with Terry Pratchett about this, and that's what he thought it was. But actually, generally speaking, we know quite a lot about foundation sacrifices, and they do tend to happen in the foundations at the outset of the building rather than being inserted later, like a cat would there. And we find them in all parts of the house, in the walls, in the roof. A fairly common feature, certainly in ones that are found in the early 20th century, is that quite often they're found in the ceiling above the entrance to a building. That's been the case with quite a few that have been reported from London, actually. And so we certainly find cats like this, from really, really early. It's definitely from the 15th century right up until the early 20th century, possibly even later. Now, one of the theories that I like about cats relates to their, is actually my own theory, I guess, but it relates to their nature, really, in that they're semi-nocturnal, kind of mysterious behavior, good at hunting vermin, and people do associate them with kind of the witch's familiar and with being a little bit supernatural. And I think that people were sort of trying to attach the spirit of the cat to their house so that it would then protect their house from lesser kinds of spiritual harm, like spells or perhaps even the witch's familiar. And that's what I think is going on. And it's important to note that certainly in the 17th century, people weren't spaying or neutering cats. So occasionally you'd be in a situation where there were far too many cats in the area, and they were actually seen as surplus, and people genuinely wouldn't notice if one disappeared. But obviously people did still used to have favourite pets. Some people have even suggested that cats like this would be there as vermin scarers, but anyone who knows the nature of rats and such knows that they would very quickly learn that the cat was dead and possibly even begin to feed on it. Right, our next find type is written charms. Now, most of our evidence of written charms comes from 19th century examples, and they were particularly common in Wales, where we have a tradition of cunning people creating these charms that thrived really until really quite recently compared to in England. Obviously, paper charms are very fragile and they can rot very easily. And also they tend to be folded up very small and tucked in between beams or under stones, that kind of thing. So they can be very difficult to find. And there's a lot of good luck involved in finding them. And essentially what was going on here with these, this one's from the mid-19th century, by the way, from a place called Sarn in Wales. And what would be going on here is that property owners would commission a cunning person to protect their property. And actually the written charm itself, the one that you can see on the screen here, is the final act in a series of rituals rather than being the sum total in itself. So this would be the sort of culmination of a series of visits that the cunning person would make to a property. They might do a series of rituals all around the corners of the property, looking at all the liminal points, doing blessings in different areas, and it would culminate in the concealment of this big final charm somewhere in the building. This particular one was found in a small file which was hidden underneath a cattle trough very close to the main farmhouse in the building. So it's not sufficient to just look at the words alone. Obviously, when you're looking at a charm like this, it's quite decorative in nature. It's clearly been laid out very deliberately. We've got the abracadabra kind of Middle Eastern spell there to the bottom left. On the bottom right, we've got a sigil here which is one that I think something similar is found in the Key of Solomon, but I can't remember the exact source for that one, but I'll come back to it. And then at the bottom, we have a series of astrological symbols as well, including some stars, but we've got the moon, Jupiter, Mercury, and also right at the bottom, we've got Yah, 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 which is essentially invoking God several times. So we've got a mix. The important thing here is that we've got a mixture of sources. We've got some ritual magic, we've got some Middle Eastern magic, we've got some astrological magic, and then the text is very religious in nature, actually. I'm going to read an extract because it's really quite long, but it says, Lord Jesus Christ, be the preserver of William Pentrinant, his cows, calves, milk, butter, cattle of all ages, mares, suckers, horses of all ages, ewes, lambs, sheep of all ages. You're getting the idea here, right? Pigs, sows, and prosper him to live luckily on this farm, saved from all witchcraft and evil men or women spirits, or wizards, or hardness of heart. Amen. Now, I think that's really interesting. You know, here we are in the middle of the 19th century, asking a cunning person, a magical person, is invoking Christ to save this person from witchcraft and evil, or men and women spirits, or wizards. So I think that really tells us an awful lot about the beliefs of people at the time and how scared they were about what might be around them. And that's a really beautiful example. And we know in particular, this particular cunning person, I can't remember his name, but was responsible for many charms which are held in the National Library of Wales in Aberystwyth. And I believe he had a brother who operated slightly north of the area as well. So there's a lot that are all written, all identical, written in the same sort of hand. This is another example that came from up in Sheffield. Yeah, we don't have that many examples of these, but enough to know that they went on and they were very popular. Right, let's talk about horse skulls. The main reason I'm using that image there is just to show just how large they are really and how impressive they are when you see a defleshed horse skull. And these cheerful chappies are just demonstrating the haul of horse skulls they recovered from underneath the building there in Wales. Now, investigation into horse skulls and why they might be concealed beneath buildings is really mainly focused on two main theories. Okay, so the writings that have gone on about this, it's quite extensive, big, large papers. One of them was from Sean O'Sullivan, who in 1954 wrote a thesis on the horse skulls that were used in Ireland. As he had discovered that in some of these little peasant cottages, there were horse skulls beneath the fireplace. And so he was a member of the Society of Antiquaries of Ireland, and he asked all the members of the Society of Antiquaries of Ireland to go out asking all their neighbours about horse skulls and did they know anything about them and what was the reason for them being there. And one of the most popular explanations for why these horse skulls were concealed, often beneath a stone in front of the hearth, was that they were there to make the dancing sound better in the evenings when people were entertaining themselves in the evenings. Now, ultimately, Sean O'Sullivan didn't believe that. He felt that that was kind of like a ruse or a story to kind of explain away the use of these horse skulls. And he felt that actually it was probably a foundation sacrifice type idea. Now, actually, I don't believe that it's the acoustic theory or the foundation sacrifice idea completely. I think there's a more nuanced explanation. So the horse skull being in front of the fireplace, we were talking about witch bottles being in front of fireplaces earlier. I think that we've got a bit of protection of the hearth area going on here. Again, you know, anything trying to enter the building through the chimney is going to come across this beastie before it goes anywhere else. I do think there could be an element of foundation sacrifice, because certainly foundation sacrifice does occur in the Eastern Europe, for example. I know of an example from Albania just a couple of years ago. Someone showed me actually a video taken from a distance, which showed some workers placing a goat on top of concrete foundations and essentially slitting the goat's throat and then doing a second pour of concrete to allow the goat to die there and be the foundation sacrifice. So we know that kind of stuff goes on now, and it definitely did go on before. But there is specifically a tradition associated with horse skulls that I think goes slightly beyond foundation sacrifices. Now, there was another author from Sweden called Albert Sandcliffe, and he did some research in threshing barns in Sweden, because he noted that some horse skulls had been recovered from beneath some threshing barns there. And he felt that it was to do, because the explanation he was given was that it was to make the sound of the flails when people were threshing wheat sound bigger and better. And it was almost like it was a rivalry between farmers to make it sound even that you had a more impressive quantity of wheat being threshed than they did. But also he although he accepted that explanation, he still considered that there may be a more ancient or more interesting reason for it. They went back a bit further. But there is a really good explanation from Cambridgeshire, where which actually I first read about in Merrifield's book, but he took it from Enid Porter's Folklore of Cambridgeshire, which describes that some men were building the foundations for a chapel in I think it's 1897 in Norfolk, and the head of the builders group sent a young lad off to the knacker's yard to fetch a horse's head, because he wasn't going to continue building until he had this. And he placed the horse's head in the foundation trench. He poured some beer over the horse's head and then shared the beer with the rest of the workers there. And then they started to shovel bricks and other rubble on top of the horse's head. And that was forming the beginning of the building of a chapel in 1897 in Norfolk. And he very clearly said that the reason for doing that was to keep evil away. So it does seem that there is a tradition of using horse skulls to keep evil away. And I think this is very much connected with the nature of a horse's skull when it has been defleshed. It does look quite intimidating. Here is my my own horse skull. This is Herbert, who lives on the shelf behind me up above. I would show you, but I have to move my camera. But yeah, you can see that they're quite fearsome looking things. And obviously we know that horse skulls are included in various folk dances as well around the country. And they have this fearsome presence. And some people think that actually the horse was associated with ancient gods associated with the sun as well. But like here is an example of a Mari Lwyd, for example, from Wales. He's become sweeping into towns and villages, scaring away lesser spirits, I think. And quite often with the Mari Lwyd, for example, there's often a sweeping element of the ritual, sweeping the hearth, which seems to be, again, clearing away evil from the hearth and protecting the people. Here's another Mari Lwyd from the same people. And here's an example from Cheshire, which Rob Gandy, who I know is in the audience today, kindly sent to me. Again, this is the sort of soul caking idea. And here's another example of a sort of simulation of a horse skull, which takes place with the hood and horse tradition down in Kent. So there's this kind of widespread tradition of dances that include horse skulls, and which seem to be, to me, to do with like scaring away or sweeping away evil. And then we find them, of course, concealed under houses as well. And there was a really good example found in the USA, actually, because we find them over there too. And it was found in the base of essentially a chimney, and it had rolled in its eye socket a piece of paper which had the name of the people in the house. And I think that that was identifying the people in the house that were going to be protected by the horse skull. Now, we also find these hordes of objects, not just single objects, and not just single shoes, but when I talked about the example of the shoe from Sittingbourne in Kent earlier on, there were huge amounts of debris recovered from voids in that building. I think there were 4 or 5 different find spots for all this stuff. And basically people over generations would be dropping sort of what we might term precious rubbish, or like objects that were broken, but which had strong linkages and strong usages with the people that had occupied those buildings. And these things that were broken, no longer useful, but were once valuable and important, were dropped into these voids. And I think that all of these things collectively served again as lightning conductors to distract evil energy away from the actual people in the house and to divert them into these areas of waste instead and to trap them there. And here's another example of a small hoard. This was found behind a fire back in an 18th century property in Perthshire and Worcestershire. And again, we've got a couple of files which probably contain some urine, amongst other things. We've got a collection of, like, essentially the family represented by a group of shoes, some toys to protect the children, a little crucifix, very crude one, and a pipe. We find all sorts of other things, but we also find protection marks. Now, the term witch marks is very common at the moment and very popularly used, but unfortunately, it's a bit too much of a catch-all kind of phrase. It doesn't really tell you anything about the types of marks that we find or the range of marks that we find. And also, it kind of ignores the fact that a lot of these marks started their life before witchcraft was really the principal fear. There were all sorts of other things people were scared of as well, just general misfortune and disease, not just witchcraft. So the example you can see on the screen now is from, well, it says on the slide, you can see from Chelvey Court in Somerset. This is a daisy wheel, which is carved onto the outside of the building. The daisy wheel is known by other names as well. Some people call it a rosette, some people call it a hex foil. But I've always called it a daisy wheel just because when I first started studying the topic, that's what they were known as. And this particular mark, the earliest examples that you can find of this in archaeology come from about 1600 BC in Egypt. You find them throughout the Mediterranean in prehistory as well. Some people even argue that some of the sort of glyphs which you can find on prehistoric monuments in places like early Neolithic Ireland resemble this. Some of the early depictions of the sun are like this. And certainly in countries where they still use this symbol, such as Romania, which I visited not that long ago, they still regard this as a solar symbol. We also find this on early 17th century graves in America, where they also regard it as a solar symbol there. And so it seems like this symbol was designed to bring the light of the sun so that darkness can't lurk in that kind of area. There's an awful lot of these symbols in the Middle East as well. In fact, you find them all over the world. They're in North Korea, China, Japan, America, all over the place. Here's an example from an 18th century corner cupboard, which I own, which is much larger than my wife was happy with. But yeah, it's still a very nice feature. And here's my favorite example. There was a really terrible, I say really terrible. There was a series by Nick Knowles about historic houses and converting them once upon a time. And I was asked to be a consultant at one point because of this door. They wanted to have a report about this door. And this door, you can see that the if you were watching earlier with the witch bottles, there was a sort of daisy motif on the front of the witch bottle that was very similar to this, carved and decorated in the same way, except that it had 8 arms instead of 6. And you can see that here we've got a daisy wheel being used as a decorative motif on an important door in a lovely early modern farmhouse. I've never seen a door like this before or since. I would like to own it, but I can't because they own it, not me. But anyway, sad face. Right, now the other thing we find a lot with protection marks, which is the term I would encourage you all to use rather than witch marks if possible, is we find the VV and M symbols, which are otherwise known as Marian marks. Now sometimes you get 2 V's which are conjoined. Now obviously when you have 2 V's that overlap and are conjoined, that is actually an archaic way of drawing a W as well. So you have to be very careful when you see them, because they often do represent initials. But if you find these VVs repeated on their own or in clusters, I think it means something else. I think it's an invocation to the Virgin Mary. And we often also find these M-type marks, which you can see there. This is actually in Prince Arthur's Chantry in Worcester Cathedral. Now, obviously, it's a chantry chapel, so the royal family have paid for monks to say prayers to protect this man's soul in death. Couldn't be better protected in the Christian world, as effectively a royal tomb, a royal chantry chapel. Yet still someone felt it necessary to put some marks invoking the protection of the Virgin Mary in there. Now, the interesting thing about the M form of the Marian marks is that often they have these tapered arms. You can see that the arms of the M are tapering outwards. And that's exactly the same way as you can see on the palm of your hand. If you look carefully at the palm of your hand, you can see exactly, I hope, or many of you will be able to see exactly that symbol. And I think that there's an association with Maria, with the Virgin Mary, and you could see it on your hand. Sometimes it was carved into stones as well. We also get mesh marks and crisscrossings. Now, these often look just like random scratches, but they're usually deliberately focused on particular areas. In the case of this house, which is a completely 18th century house in Willstone in Shropshire, all its fixtures and fittings were completely 18th century. And this is a pair of shutters that open directly to the outside. And all of the shutters in this room had this kind of mesh graffiti on them. There are other famous examples that have been found in other places, such as Knoll, which is a National Trust property in Kent. And there's a famous house in America, which has the entire gable end in the attic is completely done like this as well. And another type of mark we find quite often for protection is the deliberate burn mark as well. These burn marks are deeper than could occur by accident. And often they exist with the absence of any kind of fixing holes to suggest a lamp was ever attached there. And archaeological research has basically demonstrated that these were deliberate burn marks where you would hold a candle or another sort of flame directly against the wood. Now with oak in particular, it quickly carbonizes and it will stop burning. So you just end up with a sooty mark. But if you scrape the carbon layer away and reburn, you eventually end up with quite a deep flame-shaped mark. And these are what we call deliberate burn marks, and they're actually really common, one of the most common kinds of marks. And it seems to me, at least, that what we're doing here is where we're sort of degrading the surface, where we're burning away the wood. I think that we're ending up with kind of like a ghost candle flame. The idea that operating on the other side, on the supernatural plane, if you like, effective against supernatural enemies, we now have a candle flame, sorry, sort of burning in perpetuity, shedding light in an area to prevent darkness from lurking, in a very similar way to the daisy wheel that I mentioned earlier on. So, in conclusion, I hope you can see that there are a wide variety of methods that people used to use to protect themselves from evil, witchcraft and more. And in fact, there are more besides this. There are other objects like knife blades, anything broken can often be used as a decoy or a form of defense as well. And iron, of course, is effective against witchcraft in more ways than one. But anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and I'll be happy to take any questions from now.
Thank you very much, Brian, for your the chat that you did for us. It was very interesting. I'm sure that a lot of us have managed to find some answers to questions that we've already had about witchcraft and protection on houses. We have got a few questions come through.
Cuddles says he's traumatized. He says Brian traumatized him.
I do apologise, Cuddles.
Right. Okay, Caroline, shall I do the question? You start.
Okay. The fact that it just all changed as soon as I've gone on.
Okay, I'll start then.
Okay, if you found it, because it all moved, just unshared the screen.
Couple of things, because I get to host. So, Brian, I don't know if you ever met my father. Did you ever meet my dad?
I think so. Oh no, I met very briefly your parents one day, I think.
Yeah, I think you might have done very briefly, possibly, I don't know, at some event or the other. But anyway, my dad was a builder from Denmark. He trained as an architect. Nazis invaded, various things happened, but he served his apprentice in Denmark as a child. And he said that every Danish farmhouse has a horse's skull under the hearthstone. It's completely ubiquitous. Now, he was in Falster and Lolland, and the houses that he was talking about are not the modern wooden holiday chalets of that area, but on the southern islands, just up north of Germany. He said that horse skulls were usually buried under the actual hearthstone itself.
So that sounds like
exactly the same as in Ireland, from what you're saying.
That's very interesting. I've not heard that sort of testimony from Denmark before. So that's good.
Well, the thing is that what I was thinking is that there are lots of Danish builders and lots of Danish companies. My dad said that the tradition was that if you removed the skull, then you brought bad luck upon the house, because it was to stop evil spirits flying in through the chimney.
That's exactly the same as what I was saying, isn't it? That's good.
Yeah, it's exactly what you said, and it's exactly what he said. It's in my book Spectral Suffolk from 1990. I mention it there because the other reason I mentioned it there, and I don't know if you remember me writing Spectral Suffolk. It was me, Nicky Jordan, and Eric Quigley. You might remember those names vaguely.
I do actually, yeah.
Yeah, Q and Nicky and me wrote a book called Spectral Suffolk in 1990, and in it, we interviewed everyone in Suffolk, and one of the stories there, which I thought might amuse you, was there's a cottage on the green at Ingham. And well, there's two cottages next to one another. And in the late 70s, they were doing building work when they discovered a mummified cat in the wall. Now, no one was particularly bothered because there were mummified cats all over the place. There's one in Moyses Hall Museum. There's one in the Nutshell, the smallest pub in England. There's one in one of the pubs in Thetford. Quite a lot of buildings have them, you know, they've been taken out and they've become a sort of put above the bar in a pub as something to look at. But on this occasion, it was dug out. And shortly after it was dug out, I think it was the one next door to the Hoggard's cottage, the workmen who were working there, including my father, started to hear footsteps. And my father said, that is because you have taken out the witch ward and now the ghosts are coming for you, which no doubt made them feel much better. Well, he buggered off as he always did. And sometime later he returned and discovered that they'd all gone. And they claimed that their tools had moved and that they had left things upstairs and had found them downstairs and vice versa. And he said, oh, they are playing silly buggers. But they were so freaked out that they fled and would not continue with the building work. So they told the owner of the building, who asked my father, who claimed to know about such things, and he said, if you give me some money, I will put it back. So the cat was restored to the wall. And he said that the owner and him had a discussion because the owner said, oh, it's just where a cat has got into the wall and it's died because it's not been able to get out. And it was eating mat rats or something and it got caught. And my cat Cuddles really is that stupid. I can imagine him doing that. But he insisted that it just got into the wall cavity. And my father said it was squashed as flat as a pancake. It had been put in there dead.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's the cats do, well, any old animal can crawl away into a little void to die. But yeah, and occasionally they get stuck in places by accident as well, of course. But yeah, you have to assess each one individually to see whether it's been put there on purpose or not. But so often they have, you know. But I love that story. I like your dad's turn of phrase as well.
I'll send you the 1990 version of it, and I recorded it on video, him talking about it before he died years ago, because I recorded as many of his stories as I could. But he talks about horse skulls in Denmark, and I really do think that is worth, because if you think about it, if it started as a Danish custom or an Eastern European custom, it could very easily have reached Ireland during the Viking period.
Yeah, or vice versa. It could have started in Ireland and gone the other way.
And gone the other way. It's entirely possible either way. But I was interested that you said it's an Irish custom. Okay, okay. So those were my ridiculous stories. So let's go to the questions.
I'd like to find out more about that. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Well, I can send you a copy of the book later on, and I can see if I can find the videos. If I can, we've able to sit through hours of my father telling ghost stories.
I'd like to see it.
He didn't believe in ghosts, but he liked to tell stories about them. Right. In Canewdon, Essex, holding the bottle over a fire was called drawing of a witch and had to be done in silence. If anyone spoke, the work would be undone. Oh,
I'd like to know where that information came from and when it related to. I'm not doubting it in any way, but I'd like if that's a nice bit of folklore or lore, local legend, I'd like to know more about that for sure. Please email me any of your stories if you have any. I'm more than happy to receive them.
Dave Sivia says, oh, hi, Dave. Do you remember Dave Sivia from Bristol, from the CPRG? Well, now Dr. David Sivia, the archaeologist. The medieval grimoire, The Sworn Book, was written from a Christian perspective to defend ritual magicians as Christians. Phil says, oh, sorry, I'm late. He was busy getting hay for his guinea pigs. Horse skulls are really heavy beasts. I have one that I use to demonstrate a horse for physical therapy. We had one in Moyses Hall in Bury that's been turned into a fiddle. Have you ever seen a horse skull fiddle?
I actually did some filming for a Channel 5 thing there. I saw all of their finds there. They've got some great stuff there.
And in fact, Dave Sivia goes straight on to mention it. So yeah, there was one. Yeah, it's got my grandfather's pipe organ is in there as well. Is it a pipe organ? No, it's a piano thing that you do a thing and it plays music. I can't remember what they're called. Right. Any connection with the horse skulls used in the, I can't say this, Marie Lude? I assume that's the Welsh hobby horse thing.
Yes, yeah, I did talk about that. I did show some pictures of the Mary Lude.
Okay, that was probably after Bethan put it in. Oh, you just answered this. There we go. Yeah, similar costume and ritual appears in M. John Harrison's Baconium science fiction novels. There are witch marks in Wookey Hole caves. How do you know a witch mark from just any other random scratching? I know that sounds like a dumb question. This is
why I like to not call them witch marks, because there are actually several different types of marks, and it kind of, and not actually, there are some people at the moment who think that witch marks were made by witches, but actually they were generally, there's a range of protection marks that were used. Most of them actually have Christian origin, except for the daisy wheel. And so it's important to identify the type of mark and what its origin stories are, essentially. The Wookey Hole ones are actually really cool. There's an area in Wookey Hole, because it's a friend of mine, in fact, two friends of mine who wrote the first paper about those, Linda Wilson and Chris Binding. And there's a part of Wookey Hole called the Witch's Chimney, which has always been called that. And when you stand there, there's basically a draft that comes down onto your head, basically, and it feels really eerie when you stand there. But that area there, up in that hole, is covered in these Marian marks, and yeah.
Very... So I mean, okay, I'll come back to that in a moment. How do you date marks like that? I mean, BBM marks, Blessed Virgin Mary, obviously you can date by the iconography used and so on, but various things. How do you actually date an inscription, a stone inscription?
Well,
is it possible?
Well, it's context, isn't it? And you evaluate the context, and you look to see what sort of layers there are, whether it's certain the thing has been overwritten something else that you do know the date of, or you know the date of the structure. But it can be very difficult. It can be very difficult indeed. In fact, it can be almost impossible. Sometimes you can just know the date of the building. Obviously, in the case of a cave, you just know that there's a cave there, you know, and you try your best. It's about sort of seeing if there's any layers essentially that you can discern, and you can date parts of it, and then it's relative dating.
I remember Dad saying that he found witch bottles that contained old iron nails in Fleetwood. What was it? Fleetwood? Yeah. Cods. Sorry. In Cod's lemonade bottles. Now, those only date because they were created by my ancestor Hiram Cod. They only date back from the late 19th century, but Dad insisted they were placed in walls as witch bottles or buried in gardens more often. Mm-hmm. And he said people would urinate on nails and bury them in gardens. Now, if they were still doing that in the Edwardian era, obviously then we can tell by the bottle. But it's interesting that they were still doing it then. It was apparently a tradition that, you know, if you had been cursed or to protect your home from bad magic or whatever. The evil eye seems to have been very common. Do you hear much about the evil eye?
Yeah, but in England we tend not to sort of call it the evil eye so much. We call it more like ill wishing or you know, overlooking people. But yeah, it is essentially the same thing. It's basically eye contact was very important. It obviously still is, you know, but sharp looks in a certain context can be seen as being a form of witchcraft in itself. And I think that's what led to lots of people being accused unnecessarily of things. But also, if you look at early 20th century material, like a friend of mine, Jason Semmons, has done a lot of work on a particular, they call him the Cornish witch finder, a guy called William Painter, who used to operate from the sort of late Victorian into about the 1930s. And he collected huge amounts of lore about witchcraft beliefs at that time in Cornwall. And those witch beliefs like that were absolutely current and alive in the 1920s, for example. Where people would feel that they'd been ill-wished by someone and would immediately go out and perform a ritual or sprinkle salt on the path, that kind of thing. Still very much alive and well, those beliefs, right up until the early 20th century. And I would urge you to go and find the work of William Painter, sort of republished and edited by Jason Semmons. Very good stuff.
Excellent. Okay. So is there still much call for witchfinders? Just considering in case this doesn't pan out as a career. No, jokes aside, though, the early 20th century, as I say, that was the era when Dad said you still found lemonade bottles. What about the urine thing? Is that common in those? Is that a common belief that you put your urine in some way? Why urine?
In witch bottles, absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's part of the lure, you know. And also, people used to firmly believe, going back in the early modern period, that if you were bewitched, then some of the witch was inside you. So if you could then produce some of yourself and put it into a bottle and do things to it, you could potentially counteract the power of the witch.
So like blooding the witch, if somebody's cast a witch on you, but you make them, a witch has cast a spell on them, but you hurt them and make them bleed, that sometimes, was that a genuine European, is that European or is that British?
Oh, it was European and British, that one. But yeah, it was, blooding the witch was something that people would do less often because it includes an act of violence, obviously. But yeah, if they could do a non-violent way of removing the witchcraft, that was better, and that's where the urine comes in.
Are weapon salves similar? The notion, I mean, have you come across the weapon salve, SALVE, the idea that you could take the sword that had harmed you, and if you used the sword that could harm you, you could use it to heal you and things like that? That seems to be very much the same kind of sympathetic magic.
It does sound like the same thing. It's not something I've looked at, but generally speaking, you see, my research concentrates on things that were hidden within houses.
Right.
And obviously the protection marks aren't exactly hidden, but they're sort of hiding in plain sight because a lot of people just didn't realize the importance of them. And I saw somebody earlier on saying, you know, aren't these marks just graffiti? And yeah, it's tempting to look at it that way. But when you look at the context in enough places over a long enough period of time, you can see that there's clearly a deliberate use of them. But yeah.
Caroline, tell us about your Wookiee hole thing.
There are some areas that's only accessible to cavers. So I don't know if you've managed to get all of the marks that's available, Brian. If you haven't, I'll see if I can either get some from my records or ask the guy from Wookiee Hole who I've got a connection with to see if he can get some for you.
Excellent.
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of my friends, Chris Binding, he is the cave supervisor guy there. Do you know Chris?
Yeah, that's who I was going to ask. That's fine then.
Oh, so I probably already have seen his material, but yeah, he's a lovely guy, Chris.
He is nice, yeah.
Okay, Hannah, are you there, Hannah?
Yeah, I'm here. Sorry.
You were saying about caves in more caves, Cresswell Crags. Where's that?
Oh yeah, that's near. I used to live like right next to it in Nottinghamshire in Derbyshire. Brian, you probably know about this. I think they discovered some protection marks in the last couple of years.
Yeah, I'm actually, believe it or not, I'm actually going there tomorrow. But
Okay.
a friend of mine called Alison Fern identified some marks in there that she protection marks, and I think they've made quite a feature of them. I think they still refer to them as witch marks in their tours, which I hope to try and bring a bit more detail into that description when I go there tomorrow. But yeah, I'm going to look at the same marks basically tomorrow.
Oh, that's really exciting.
Cool. I'm looking forward to it.
Dave Sivia. Can you hear us, Dave? Can you unmute yourself, or do you not have a microphone? You can.
I can hear you.
Go on then, Dave. Tell us about Aveline's Hole. Is that how you say it?
Yes. They used to take the students on the MA in Landscape Archaeology course at Bristol University down there right at the beginning. As you know, there was a regular Friday to show where they were every Friday they were showing a different landscape. And Aveline's Hole contains its Ice Age. And it's one of those, I've seen pictures of it. I mean, I never went, unfortunately. It's just a tiny little piece with what looks like a cross-hatched pattern. And to my mind, it looks like it looks like it might be the Antarctic art being produced during the Paleolithic, and then the megalithic age, as supposedly as part of shamanic experiences to do with the afterlife.
Yeah, I think that Linda Wilson, who's one of Chris Binding, again, one of his friends, she's actually the curator of the Caving Association at Bristol University, the Speleological Society, and she curates their museum there. And I think she's written a paper about Aveline's Hole, which I think is available online somewhere. And it does have some of the Marian marks we were talking about, the sort of VVs and M's which crop up so often in these caves. So yeah, there's certainly some stuff which we would call protection marks that has been found there as well. Seems like they're quite common in caves actually, because people were just naturally a little bit afraid of the dark hole beneath them.
With so many, well, every now and then there's a legend that some of these places, like St. Patrick's Purgatory, are entrances to hell.
Yeah, entrances to the underworld as well, isn't it? There's supernatural forces down below. Yeah, that's cool. It's a good example, that one.
Dr. Spring says, Brian, where was the building in the US you mentioned?
Okay, let me just open up. I just have to find it. Okay.
What about witch balls? Do you know much about witch balls? They seem to be entirely New England.
I do a bit actually. They're more of well, you do get witch balls in this country as well, but again, I think the idea came across from America. But essentially, witch balls and witch canes, all of the kind of glass distracting baubles and the sort of tasks for the devil to count this many beads and all that. All of those ideas seem to have become more popular in the Victorian era.
Right.
But they're sort of based on sort of folk ideas from earlier, the kind of glistening, distracting kind of effects.
Do they count as folklore, or are they?
No, I think they people did believe them at the time, but I think they're just more recent, is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. So, okay, Bethan has sent you the link to the Canuden Witch Bottle story, which is Eric Maple from Folklore Volume 71, Number 4, 1960. That was the source.
I'll open that link and save it. Thank you very much.
Dr. Spring says there are witch marks in St. Michael's Mount, or rather the house on St. Michael's Mount. And at that point, we've gone through. Oh, and why has my cat changed colour? Well, that was quite cunning, wasn't it? Yeah. I no longer have a ginger cat and I have a black cat. Okay, well, thank you very much indeed.